This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Almost 20 years ago, while the U.S. was mired in Afghanistan, we were also fighting in Iraq. In the earliest days of the war, the U.S. was facing significant challenges from insurgents in Iraq, and few on the battlefield had an effective answer. But a fresh-faced, stern David Petraeus was developing a strategy that was a throwback to a different era of fighting. In 2003, he was then a major general, a two-star. Petraeus took command of the 101st Airborne Division in Baghdad. It was his first exposure to combat. And while on the battlefield, he deployed classic counterinsurgency methods to build trust with Iraqi citizens, including building community security forces, overseeing public works and construction projects, and reinforcing the political process with local elections. Many war scholars and analysts believe his tactics influenced a return to a tried-and-true American warfare doctrine. But Petraeus had his critics, too. It was argued his achievements were exaggerated. His tactics failed to end bloodshed in either Afghanistan or Iraq. In the years since he retired from military service, he's been an advisor in the world of finance and venture capital. He's consulted with business leaders on effective leadership. In June, he came to San Francisco to take part in the Leading from the Front speaker series at the Marines Memorial Association. He was joined on stage by news correspondent Mike Serra. They talked about the state of the war in Ukraine, China's saber-rattling with Taiwan, and he offered insights on how the small nations can continue to contend with formidable superpowers. Here's an excerpt from their conversation.
Well, I had the honor, if not the pleasure, to see General Petraeus in action at work in the field in difficult situations. 19 years ago, Mosul, Iraq, he steps into probably the mother of all leadership crises. The country was coming apart, the insurgency was starting, the economy was on its knees, and he had to stand up a police force because the last one got fired. General, I've been hearing the prototype for leadership in these difficult times, a lot of people believe, is Vladimir Zelensky. And I think you've spent some time with him. Here's a guy who had no military experience, no diplomatic experience, was a comedian.
But an actor.
And an actor. And now
he's got the part of a lifetime. We're talking about Volodymyr Zelensky, the president, obviously, of Ukraine. But the truth is his first 2 1/3 years there were not that distinguished. And all of a sudden, Russia invades, and he is positively Churchillian. He's gotten the big ideas right repeatedly. His communication skills have been extraordinary. He's overseen the implementation of this brilliantly as well. And they've determined repeatedly how they need to refine the big ideas and do it again and again. And so I was just out there and did meet with him. Very impressive, as you might imagine. I didn't actually want to talk about the military stuff with him, of all things. But I actually asked him, what are you doing to win the peace? You have this moment of extraordinary national unity. And I've been going to Ukraine since it was actually still a republic in the Soviet Union. It was the first time I was the aide to the chief of staff of the army, the first chief to visit the Soviet Union since George C. Marshall went to Yalta. So this is quite a historic visit. And then many times since then, including a couple of times, again, as a partner at KKR, where we were looking at various opportunities, we always just shrunk from those, stepped back because of the lack of adequate rule of law. Oligarchs and companies dominate an entire sector, monopolistic powers, government bureaucracy, lack of transparency and integrity, corruption, all of this. It was a very challenging landscape. So I laid that out, said, what are you going to do to make this, we should be competing for this destination instead of shrinking from it, especially because you're going to need that given all the damage. There will be a Marshall-like reconstruction plan, but they really need the private sector.
One of the things that Putin seems to be betting on is how long the Western support will last. He's hoping that he might get an election here.
Yep.
And
sure.
And of course, we've been giving them enormous amounts of materials.
Huge quantities. Again, $38 billion. Again, by the way, I am completely non-political, not just bipartisan. I don't even register to vote, much less vote. And I don't support or contribute to candidates, and I advise members of either party. So when I offer this, I actually think the Biden administration has done a very impressive job in leading the entire world, not just NATO, but the entire Western world in responding. $38 billion of arms, ammunition, and assistance. Yes, there's some decisions I'd like to have seen taken much earlier than they were. The tank decision, the F-16 or Western aircraft decision, now the Army Tactical Missile System, dual purpose improved conventional munitions. There's a handful of these that we've dragged our feet, but you can't argue with $38 billion. It's just extraordinary what we have done.
Some
and again,
say
keeping the alliance together. But you're right. Putin still thinks that the Russians will be able to outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans. And we have to help Ukraine prove him wrong and help Europe prove him wrong.
Do you think it's possible for either side to win militarily?
I actually think it may be.
Really?
Again,
I mean,
let's see.
not just a stalemate.
It's not going to happen this summer. But here's the situation. The Russian forces have been in combat in many cases for 12 to 14, 15 months. They had not learned what we learned the hard way in Vietnam, that you don't do individual replacement, you do unit replacement, which is what we did do in Iraq and Afghanistan and worked well. So when they take losses, these units have often been rendered combat ineffective. And normally you should pull them off the line. You should, in a safe place, replace the personnel they've lost, the equipment they've lost, and retrain them for 30 days or so that you rebuild the cohesion and the trust and, that sense of responsibility for each other, the brotherhood of the close fight, as they say, and so forth. They don't do that. They stay in the line by and large, and they just add people back in. And that does not produce, again, a well-trained, cohesive, well-disciplined, well-equipped organization. The leadership is quite abusive. They're famously abusive. The culture in these organizations is actually of committing war crimes rather than preventing them adhering to the Geneva Convention. And they have very limited reserves behind their lines. They're basically along these lines, in many cases, forward of their defensive positions, which means that they'll have to withdraw under contact with the enemy, which is the toughest possible maneuver. And here come the Ukrainians. They have units that they have been building. There are 6 armored brigades alone, and then a number of other brigades. They will have Western tanks, Western infantry fighting vehicles, Western artillery, all kinds of other Western systems, much better command and control systems. And they've been training at our training centers in Germany, in Eastern Poland, in the UK, elsewhere. And they have experienced leaders. Some of the troops, to be sure, are new, but they're going to go at this.
But having met with Zelensky, is there any question in your mind that he's fighting all out to win the knockout punch and not just negotiating for position in a settlement?
Well, he cannot even hint that he is willing to accept anything less than Ukraine whole and free. Keep in mind that these people are fighting their war of independence. And again, we need to do everything we can to help them win it. This is as right versus wrong as it can possibly get. But when dynamics change, it's conceivable that there should be and could be a negotiated resolution. Keep in mind that for Ukraine, they need to stop the bleeding. Every night that we were there, we were getting, it wasn't quite the blitz, the way BBC made it sound, but there were air raid sirens every single night. And yes, they're knocking down every missile and just about every drone, but people still get killed by the debris that fell. 3 of them were killed in one single night alone. So don't ever say no that there could be some kind of negotiated resolution. Keep in mind, this isn't just about the battlefield losses for Putin. And keep in mind as well, they lost more in a single battle that they took this one city in the winter, barely, and now they're in the process of losing it. They lost 20,000 soldiers in that one fight in their failed winter offensive. A continuation of failure. They failed, they lost the Battle of Kyiv, they lost the Battle of Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Kherson, and Kharkiv province. They did not achieve control of Donetsk and Luhansk, which was the objectives. Yes, they did get, again, this one city, but 20,000 losses in a few months over a meaningless city they destroyed, basically, in taking it. That's 5,000 more than they lost in nearly a decade in Afghanistan, which was unsustainable. And what we have to convey to Putin is that this war is unsustainable on the battlefield and also, by the way, on the home front. And we need to tighten down further the personal, financial, and economic sanctions and export controls.
You say this is their revolutionary war. Is this our proxy war, given the losses that the Russians have taken there and equipment, people?
Sure, in many respects it is. Keep in mind that there were 2 major security concerns for the United States. You know, the biggest far and away is China and the relationship between the U.S. and the West and China. Obviously, that's the focus. But Russia was the other. And this dramatically reduces the threat that Russia will pose when this is all eventually resolved. Obviously, there's still North Korea. Yes, there's Islamist extremists. Yes, there's insurgencies that we've now figured out because of the advent of drones and a lot of other systems that we can fight these by advising, assisting, and enabling host nation forces rather than having to do it all for ourselves, which is quite a dramatic revolution.
Having spent the last 10 years on the financial side of the equation, are you surprised that the sanctions, the economic sanctions, weren't more effective than they seem not to have been?
Not entirely. I mean, you have to understand their economy. You have to understand the sources of their revenue. You have to understand that there are people in the world that will buy Russian oil at a discount, certainly. I mean, we're a bit disappointed to see India be among those. But, you know, those are the realities of life.
Could we do more?
We can and we should and we are. Actually.
I mean, can we put pressure on India not to buy Russian oil?
No, look, I mean, we can't even, there's all kinds of carve-outs here. Keep in mind that Ukraine is still allowing Russian gas to transit its soil. Why? Because they make money off. I mean, in the middle of war, they are facilitating that because they get huge revenue from it, and they think that they may still be getting some natural gas from it. So there's all these carve-outs. You know, Hungary wouldn't agree to this until they got a carve-out. So again, there are realities in life. One of the big takeaways about the world is that certainly we should always have our ideals. We should always have the values that we cherish and would like to see flourish elsewhere. But you know, you have to deal with the world the way that it is, not the way that you would like it to be. And I think occasionally administrations get a bit out on the idealistic side and then eventually have to come back to the realistic side.
Well, the last few minutes we have here, let's shift geography a little bit. This new world order, a lot of drama this week in the Taiwan Straits. Had Ukraine not emerged like it did, would all of our focus be there rather than in Eastern Europe?
Look, that is still the main effort for our country and really for the Western world. The single biggest development of the last 10 years, and you know, what I do at KKR, I don't structure deals, I should, acknowledge here. I do geopolitical risk and figure out how we can mitigate it. We integrate the macroeconomic analysis, the environmental social governance issues analysis, and then, again, identify risks to the success of an investment. We figure out how to mitigate them, or we say we shouldn't do this deal, which I've vetoed a number of deals over the years. And then you help the companies once you've made the investments. That's our focus. The single biggest development during that 10-year period has been the evolution of geopolitics from a world of benign globalization in which barriers to trade, investment, capital flows were all being gradually reduced, going down, and global trade was going up at about a 45-degree angle. And now we're in an era of renewed great power rivalries in which the barriers are all going up again and in which globalization has become slowbalization. It's still gradually increasing, but at a relatively low rate. And a lot of that is more regionalization, actually, than it is true globalization. This is a profound change. And the single biggest reason has been the continued rise of China, the more aggressive actions and assertive actions by China, whether it's wolf warrior diplomacy, economic coercion, again, what they're doing in the Taiwan Strait, in the airspace out there, again, killing Indian soldiers of the line of actual control in 3 different fights, dozens of them, and on and on. And all of that without shielding at all or hiding at all what their aspirations are.
What would you say is the risk assessment for invading Taiwan? If you're in China, or if you have a financial stake in a semiconductor company in Taiwan, what do you think the risk assessment is there now?
We don't expect an invasion of Taiwan. We think, number one, we have some agency here, and it's called deterrence. And deterrence rests on a potential adversary's assessment of 2 elements. One, your capabilities, and the other, your willingness to employ those capabilities. And we have to transform, above all, our military capabilities. By the way, there's other factors in there too. There are trade, it's legal, it's diplomatic, it's economic, and so forth. But it really rests on the assessment of our military capabilities. And we have to transform our military, by and large. This is very overly simplistic, but from a small number of very large platforms that are incredibly capable, but hugely expensive, very heavily manned, and frankly, quite vulnerable in a world in which we finally have operationalized the old NATO adage, which we didn't operationalize then, which was, if it can be seen, it can be hit. If it can be hit, it can be killed. You can see everything nowadays. In the Indo-Pacific, you can be seen, you can therefore be targeted, and very likely you might be hit. We have to transform from that world to one of a vastly larger number of unmanned ground, sea, subsea, air, space, and cyberspace systems, very, very capable still. But many of these are either remotely piloted or actually increasingly going to be algorithmically piloted. And where the person in the loop, hang on to your seat here, but the person in the loop is eventually going to be the person that designs the algorithm rather than some person who has his or her hands on the control. We've got to make that transformation because that's what will enhance deterrence. Now, you also have to improve the resilience of our bases out there. We have a lot of people that have spent time deployed in the bases out in the Indo-Pacific. And again, if it can be seen, it can be hit. And we have to improve the defenses of them. We've got to go deeper. We have to harden them and all the rest of this. And the Pacific Defense Initiative is intended to do a lot of that. And it got the best funding this year that it has ever gotten. I think it's $10 or more billion. So because of that, because we are undertaking this transformation, and frankly, because the president has 4 times seemed to slip up and say that, yes, we'll come to the rescue of Taiwan. And then, of course, Jake Sullivan goes out and says, but our policy of strategic ambiguity is still in place, no change, or you still adhere to the, this and this and this. But that's significant. And that is, I believe, intended to make sure that there's no question that we would take action. And then we have, we're back in the Philippines, 4 bases there again, thankfully with President Marcos at the helm. So you're seeing this lattice work being stitched around the first island chain and so forth, and then beyond. All of a sudden, we're paying attention to the island hopping campaign, these islands that Marines sacrificed so much to liberate from the Japanese. They're important again.
But General, we were talking before about Iraq and Afghanistan, maybe even back to Vietnam. In this very interconnected world, non-state actors, political insurgencies, and all this stuff, in a traditional sense, are wars winnable by the military?
Sure, they are. Yeah. I mean, again, not always.
Or is the military more of a deterrence now to get to a negotiating zone?
It depends on what the context is. I mean, the Gulf War was quite winnable, and it was won. Panama was won. Korea, again, you at least stabilized the border where it was. Vietnam, obviously not. Grenada was. Again, so it depends on the context, on the situation. And what we want to do, again, look, a war with China, I don't think you could say that any side's going to win something like that. It has to be avoided. It has to be deterred. You have to dissuade President Xi or his successor from even considering that.
Do you take stock in anything that they say that maybe President Xi is somewhat humbled by the failures of Putin in
There's
Ukraine?
a big debate about this, about what lessons China is taking, what lessons the Politburo Standing Committee and President Xi himself, of course, noting that, this is an unprecedented 3rd term as party leader, from which follows the presidency and the chairman of the military commission. But no, there's a bit of a debate going on about whether this has a chastening effect, a cautionary effect, or if they say, we're not corrupt like the Russians. We have professional forces. We're better equipped. All of this, you could argue that. I tend to think this is a more cautionary tale than not. And the Chinese are very conscious that they have not been in combat since the late 1970s against Vietnam. And that actually didn't turn out all that well for them. All of our adversaries, when they get to visit Washington, they all want to come out to the CIA. And I was happy to have them out there. And so we'd bring the Chinese generals in, and somewhere along the line, I'd say, well, of course, falsely humbly, I'd say, well, of course, I did have 5 combat commands as a general officer, but I know that all of you have had lots of, maybe you haven't actually, Look, you have a lot of people in this room that have been in combat, and you don't know until you're in it how people will respond. You don't know how your forces are going to do. You remember that great Mike Tyson quote, everybody has a plan until he gets punched in the nose. And they are conscious of that. They haven't really done anything remotely like what it is they would have to do. I don't need to tell folks in this room how an amphibious assault across a 100-mile expanse of open ocean can go seriously wrong.
General Petraeus, we thank you for your service in all these different fields, the military, intelligence, now in the world of finance, and thank you for your insights.
No, I thank you. Thanks, and I mean that.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Maya Kegley, Sienna Barnes, and Andrew Stelzer. A special thanks to Chris Dobson at World Affairs and the team at the Marines Memorial Association. It was fact-checked by our intern, Adam Ailey. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yunn is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.